Hello, everyone. Welcome to This Week in Sports. Alongside Casey Bryant and Dustin Cooley, I'm Olivia Jakewith. Tonight, we will open with the final college football playoff rankings, divulge into what happened in Week 14 of the NFL, and update you on the playoff race. Then we will talk about what may be the upset of the season in NCAA basketball and talk about how the Yankees livened up their offseason. Now, Ohio State will join Alabama, Oregon, and Florida State in the college football playoffs. Even after defeating Iowa State by 52 points Saturday, does TCU deserve to be bumped from the top four in favor of the Buckeyes?
Well, I can certainly see where TCU has reason to be upset at the selection committee for being bumped out of the college football playoffs, because when you put them at the 3 seed the week before, we had said last week on the show that it gives them a certain air of invincibility, that it's kind of the NCAA's way of telling them that they are safe, putting them ahead of the undefeated Florida State. And they did beat up on Iowa State, and really, how could the NCAA selection committee not foresee that? I mean, it was pretty obvious that TCU was going to beat up on Iowa State. I suppose the one argument that you could make was that Ohio State, it was expected to be a little more of a highly contested battle between them and Wisconsin, and they beat up on Wisconsin. They shut them out 59-0. So I can kind of see how Ohio State beating up on a ranked opponent is a little more of a momentum shift than TCU beating up on an already pretty bad Iowa State team. But I think the fact that TCU was at the 3 spot, it just kind of confuses them. I can totally see where TCU has reason to be upset. If they were at the 4 spot the week before, there wouldn't be as much backlash right now.
You know, I think it was kind of overestimated how safe they were, honestly, since Florida State was put in at number 4 and they're undefeated. I think there was absolutely no chance they were going to get knocked out of the top 4. So obviously, TCU was the team on the chopping block. And I think it's more than well-deserved. Ohio State proved to me in this game that they are incredibly dominant. Against the 13th-ranked Wisconsin, they won 59-0. Didn't give up a single point to one of the better teams in the nation versus TCU, which did kill Ohio State, but Iowa State. But they've got a 2-10 record on the season. I mean, what are you going to expect?
The one argument I would make, though, is that if you can already foresee them beating up on Iowa State, then why wouldn't you take a look at maybe the whole season on the whole? Because it was such a huge disparity between the two opponents that they were playing. Why not have a look at their entire season and look at the fact that Ohio State lost to a Virginia Tech team that finished at 500 at 6-6, whereas TCU lost to Baylor, where Baylor was obviously in the mix as well for the top 4 seeds. So I would say that it just kind of is misleading a little bit the way that TCU was seeded beforehand.
You did touch on this a bit, but what comparisons can you make between TCU and Ohio State?
Well, I mean, they're obviously both incredibly powerful teams in college football. I would say that, TCU was an offensive powerhouse through the entire season, and the one loss that they did have was to Baylor, and it was a 61-58 shootout. I think that TCU is honestly one of the best offensive teams in college football, whereas Ohio State, they usually ride on the genius, really, of Urban Meyer. Urban Meyer has an SEC style of coaching. I think he's a great, great mind running the offense for Ohio State. So I would say that, they're two very similar programs in that they're both dominant. They just go a different ways about it. I would say that it's going to be a shame that TCU's offense isn't going to be able to put on a show during the college football playoffs.
We're going to get a better show out of Ohio State. I think that Ohio State's offense is even better than TCU's, no matter how dominant they've been. Over the entire season, TCU's beaten 3 teams that are currently ranked. Number 20, Oklahoma, number 9, Kansas State, and 25, Minnesota. While Ohio State has beat number 8 Michigan, also beaten Minnesota, and just beat Wisconsin at number 13. So they're really beating better opponents. And in terms of the margin of victory, on most of the games, they both are blowing teams out. It's really not a huge difference to me in terms of offense. But something I did note is the margin of a couple of the games where they were actually close. The one loss that we said Ohio State had was 35-21 to Virginia Tech, which is, it's a decent score to lose by. But the teams, the games that they are winning, only 2 of those games they won by 7 points or less, and both of those games were won by 7 points. Versus TCU, who won 3 games by less than 4 points, and one of those being only 1 point. So they're not really as dominant as I think people are giving them credit for on offense.
That's fair.
Now, CFP Committee Chairman Jeff Long made a point to say that the strength of the conference Big 10 versus Big 12 didn't factor into the decision. Did the fact that Baylor and TCU were called co-champions skew the system?
I would say it probably did a little bit, yes, because obviously, having one definitive champion would have made things a whole lot easier at the very least, because then you wouldn't have that sort of question of whether TCU or Baylor was the better team. I do think, though, that TCU was, again, a victim of circumstance a little bit, in that you have them tied with Baylor, which is, again, one of the top 5 teams in the country, top 6 teams in the country, and you have them just on the outside looking in out of the mere fact that they are tied with Baylor, which is one of the top 6 teams in the country. It can be a little confusing, and I do think, though, that it's good to have this sort of debate. I think that this is obviously a sign that the playoff system is working for college football. I just think it's a little confusing, and I do think that TCU is a victim of circumstance. They certainly have a right to be upset. I can certainly see where they're coming from.
I think there's absolutely no controversy, no kind of reason why you would really need to pick one of those 2 teams or not pick them as the case happened, just because they're tied as co-champions. I think there's no reason to that. Certainly some people are going to try and use that as an excuse, I would say, but when it comes down to picking teams for the playoffs, or really I should say earning your spot in the playoffs, it's really about who is the best team. And I think, in fact, I'm actually proud that the committee chose Ohio State and saw that they are the better team, instead of getting involved in politics and what really would have been a big political discussion had one of those teams been chosen.
I suppose the one point that you could make is that there would have been probably more of a controversy if, say, Baylor or TCU would have been chosen over Ohio State or the other. Just because you would have had the argument that, let's say TCU had been chosen to stay in the top 4, you would have had the argument that, well, Baylor had the head-to-head advantage over them. Why didn't Baylor get in? Because they beat them. And then you could, vice versa, you can make the argument that TCU dominated the whole game against Baylor and really only gave it up just at the end, and it was 61-58. It's so hard to choose who is definitively the better team. So I would say that there probably would have been more of a controversy, you're right, if Baylor or TCU would have been chosen over the other. I do see your point in that.
So now we have Ohio State versus Alabama, Meyer versus Saban. Who wins the Sugar Bowl?
I have Alabama beating Ohio State, if only just because I think that Nick Saban is one of the smartest coaches in college football. Granted, he is going up against Urban Meyer, a coach that is no stranger to Nick Saban and his style, both of them playing in the SEC. I think that is definitely going to be a fun matchup to watch. Urban Meyer versus Nick Saban, 2 of the greatest coaches really in the country. This is exactly what you want in the college football playoff, and again, that's really the benefit of Ohio State coming in, is that you do get that headline matchup of Ohio State and Alabama, 2 of the most storied programs in the country. You do get Saban versus Meyer. It's going to be a fun game to watch, but I do think that Alabama will come away with the victory.
I absolutely agree. I think this is a tremendous game to watch, and I think the fans are really the winners here. Even not just the more involved fans, but the casual fans who aren't really into college football so much. Ohio State is a name that they're going to recognize, and it's a game that they're going to want to watch because of it. It's really going to be a tremendous game. Like you said, it's absolutely tremendous coaches. They're going to be known as Hall of Famers by the end of their career when it eventually happens. And Alabama, they've already proven to us they can get in. Ohio State, they've made a very nice hot run to get into that last spot. And it's really going to be kind of a fight to me of talent versus are you hot?
Now, number 2 seed Oregon versus defending national championship FSU. Who wins the Rose Bowl?
Well, as opposed to having the focus being on the coaches in this one, it's really more on the quarterback battle. I think that the battle between Marcus Mariota and Jameis Winston is going to be so much fun to watch. I do think that Mariota and the Ducks are going to have the advantage in this one, if only just because we saw Jameis Winston was a little fallible in his game against Florida, a team which hasn't been very good and has already fired Will Muschamp, their head coach, as a sign of the struggling times for the Florida Gators. So I think that Jameis Winston was not able to take control when he had the opportunity to. I do think that Mariota, who is very clearly the best quarterback in my opinion, he's going to run away with the Heisman this year. I think that Mariota and the Ducks are going to be meeting Nick Saban and the Alabama Crimson Tide in the national championship.
And that's where you are completely wrong. Jameis Winston is going to take this team to the championship game. He has been known all season for coming up in the fourth quarter clutch. That team, although Oregon may be dominating him in the first 3 quarters, I think they'll find a way to come through in the fourth quarter. Honestly, they've really shown to me why else would I expect anything from them in the fourth quarter. Over the past 2 years, they haven't lost a single game. I mean, they've really shown to me that they are going to perform, where as a team like Oregon, they don't have the best history when it comes to big games.
Who wins that national championship that you just predicted?
I have Oregon riding it all the way out. I'm going to have to disagree with you there, Dustin. I do think that Mariota is one of the hottest quarterbacks. Say what you want about Florida State in the fourth quarter, but I think that it's going to be out of reach by that point. But for the fact that Mariota is going to ride the hot hand, he's going to show why he is not only one of the best quarterbacks in the country, but one of the best leaders. And I think it's Oregon's time to shine finally. I think that Oregon is finally going to rise to prominence because it's been a few years coming, really, for Oregon, that they've been building up this strong program. I think that it's finally time for them to rise up and take the national championship, finally stealing it away from Nick Saban's clutches. I mean, the past couple of years, Saban's been beaten in the championship. I think it's about time that Alabama's reign of terror ends and some new faces get up there.
I'm actually glad that you brought up that Nick Saban has been beaten in the championship a couple times. I think he wants this more than ever. When you get beaten in the championship, it is the worst feeling, at least in my opinion, in sports. You are hungrier than ever to come back and win. And although I do agree with you that Mariota is a tremendous quarterback, he is absolutely going to be a top pick in the NFL when he goes pro. But Alabama's defense is phenomenal. I've certainly given what I think about them on previous shows, and they've proven game after game how dominant they can be on the defensive end. And I think that's going to counteract, really, what Mariota's been doing for Oregon.
And if anyone can lead them to the national championship, who else than a guy who's done it several times before, Nick Saban, really?
Absolutely.
Now, the ranking system that got us here, clearly flawed. How can you compare it to the BCS computer system?
I wouldn't necessarily call it flawed so much as it is controversial, which really I think is what you want for college football. The best thing that could possibly happen to college football is the fact that people are talking about college football. The college football selection system is what is going to generate interest in the college football playoffs. Now that you have 4 teams instead of 2 teams, you have the very cream of the crop. You're not letting in some outliers, and you have all of this debate over who is the best team, whether or not the 4 seed can pull off the upset. So I think this is a great system, and I don't think that you can expect any change soon, if only just because change comes very slowly for the NCAA. I do think, though, that this 4-team playoff system is the way to go. I think it's such a step up from the previous system, and I think that a change, why not ride it out to see what future years can hold? Because 1 year is such a small sample size. I think that you should leave it as is to see whether or not this actually is the true system that you can use, which I think, honestly, it is a good system.
I do agree that I like the system. I certainly like it better than the 2-team playoff. I think it's a lot fairer. I'm a personal fan of the way the pro sports do it, where you've got a couple of games to really figure out who the champion is. Teams that aren't just automatically ranked number 1 actually get a shot at this. I would think that maybe more teams should get in. I certainly wouldn't expect it for a while, especially if we have some tremendous games. My championship game with Alabama and Florida State, I don't think you could really ask for anything better on television. With Nick Saban going up against
undefeated Seminoles.
Yes, that's honestly the best matchup I think you could really get. And because of that, I don't think this system is going to change for a while, but I would hope that it's going to maybe move towards more professional football, where maybe we'll get some more teams. Certainly, we can't put every college team in there. There's thousands upon thousands. But better teams really do deserve a shot, not just the top teams.
I think it is worth noting that for all the controversy over whether or not Ohio State belongs in the playoff, neither one of us have them advancing past the mighty Alabama Crimson Tide. I think that's at least worth noting that, for all this debate, they are still very much so the underdog. So I think that letting in more teams would be a little dangerous in that regard, whereas you have all this controversy over who should be the 4th seed, and the 4th seed is still very much so the underdog. I think that's just worth noting at the very least.
There you have it with college football. When we return, we'll be talking about the NFL. Welcome back. Let's get right into another dramatic week in the NFL that heated up the playoff races in the AFC and NFC. Now, the Cleveland Browns lost a competitive edge this weekend with a 25-24 loss to the Colts. Should they now go to Manziel, or is another part of the team to blame?
Mr. Money Manziel is still finding a way to make headlines despite the fact he is not playing. It's a sad truth. But the fact is, Money Manziel should not be starting. There is no reason they need to switch quarterbacks. I know Brian Hoyer is struggling as of late. He certainly did struggle against the Colts, throwing 14 of 31 passes with 0 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and a very, very ugly QBR of 15.2.
Yikes.
One of the worst that you're going to see all year, if not the worst. But Brian Hoyer has a couple of things going for him that Johnny Manziel does not have. First of all, he's more mature than Manziel in every sense of the word. We know that Manziel has got his problems off the field. even when he got drafted by the Cleveland Browns and they asked him, can you cut down your off-the-field antics, your partying? He said no to a team that just drafted him in the first round. That's supposed to be his new home. In addition to that, Brian Hoyer has known their number one receiver, Josh Gordon, and has shown how good he can be with him. If you saw anything of last season, Josh Gordon was a tremendous top talent, and he's not having the best start since he's come back from his incredibly long suspension, but that connection is very, very valuable to a team that doesn't have a lot of offensive options. So I don't think there's any reason to really shake up that locker room and put in a new quarterback to lead the team, let alone an immature one.
You touched on it a little bit. I've been as staunch a defender of Brian Hoyer as you can possibly be, really, these past couple of weeks, saying, why would you want to upset the apple cart and create this cause for dissension by pulling out your confident starting quarterback for a guy like Manziel? Now all of a sudden, after a couple of bad starts from Hoyer, and they have been bad, they aren't totally on him, but they have been bad. You have to start to maybe. There's a little bit of a seed of doubt there. I don't think it's wholly on Brian Hoyer, if only just because, yes, that connection with Josh Gordon was strong last season. This season, there have been questions whether or not Josh Gordon is in shape. Chris Mortensen of ESPN said that there have been complaints that Josh Gordon hasn't been training as hard while he was absent. So you saw Brian Hoyer overthrow Josh Gordon a couple of times. As it came down to the wire last game, was that a case of Brian Hoyer overthrowing him or Josh Gordon being a step slower because he's out of shape? We'll never be able to determine that, so you wonder maybe that's the reason why Josh Gordon hasn't been as dominant this year. Honestly, I think that there hasn't been as good a protection of Brian Hoyer of late, too, from his offensive line. But honestly, I think that now you're starting to get to the question of, after a couple of bad losses for Brian Hoyer and the Cleveland Browns, maybe it is time to start to consider a quick hook at the very least, maybe give Hoyer a half, and if he isn't as dominant as he has been, maybe it's time to put in Manziel. Manziel, in all his maturity, there was a video after he overthrew Josh Gordon last week of Johnny Manziel mouthing, "I would have effing hit him." Meaning that, does that mean that Manziel is more confident in his ability to hit his receivers? Manziel is hungry for the start, so maybe that energy is enough for the Browns, but this is such a weird transition to make for the Browns because the Browns are poised to make a playoff run in one of the most competitive divisions in the NFL. It's a strange situation. I say go with Hoyer and give him a half, honestly. Evaluate his talent, maybe see if the team needs a spark plug, because sometimes a change is what's necessary to build up your energy.
You both make some excellent points, and not to mention the fact that the Browns defense forced 4 turnovers in this Colts matchup this weekend. So getting back to Josh Gordon, after his 10-game suspension under the NFL's new policy, since his return, the Browns are 0-3. What's going on with him?
Josh Gordon is really being a scapegoat for a Browns team that is not supposed to compete. They're in a weak division. They have a solid record, which is credit for some of the guys that have been around since before Gordon showed up after his 10-week suspension. But Josh Gordon, he is certainly rusty. We can certainly see some of that. It's going to happen when you're out of the NFL that long playing. But I'd actually like to bring up something that you actually mentioned just earlier. On the final throw of the game from Brian Hoyer, it was a Hail Mary bomb trying to save the game, some miracle, to Josh Gordon on the sideline. He almost caught that. It was a very close diving catch at the very end. He did fumble a little bit with his hands on a dive, but it was an incredibly difficult pass to catch with the defense all over him. And I give him a lot of credit for even having a shot at doing that.
Josh Gordon, they need Josh Gordon to be their number one receiver, honestly. And at this point in time, I don't think that you can rely on him that much. And we saw it during the game. He was only targeted 7 times throughout the entire game. I think the Browns are finally conceding that Josh Gordon isn't on top of his game this season. He's not going to be the dominant number one threat that we saw of him last season. I think that honestly, and conceding that fact is incredibly difficult for the Cleveland Browns to make because honestly, the Browns need a guy like Josh Gordon because who else really do they have that is a legitimate down-the-field threat? They're starting to get him back, and I just think that they're rushing too soon into making a lethal weapon out of Josh Gordon. I think that honestly, they have to pull back a little bit, and if Josh Gordon is out of shape, whip him back into shape. I don't even know how to fix that problem because how can you have your number one receiver out of shape as you're trying to make a playoff push? I mean, it's a difficult situation that the Browns are in.
I mean, the fact that he misjudged the ball completely is just a hand-eye coordination issue.
Absolutely, yeah. He just doesn't look like he's on the same page with Hoyer anymore, and that's something that you so needed heading into these last couple of weeks. All of a sudden, Josh Gordon's back. It was a godsend for the Browns to have that connection back. and to not have that be as lethal as it was, it's just crushing.
Right. So now we're taking a look at the AFC playoff picture as it stands. We have the Pats, the Broncos, Colts, and Bengals leading the division. Are you surprised? What are your reactions?
You know, I'm not surprised at all. All those 4 teams at the start of the season are the teams I predicted to win those divisions, and 3 out of the 4 of those I think are going to stick and keep those. The Patriots, they're going to be a tremendous team. Broncos, same with them. The Colts, we did just see a close game with a Browns team that I just criticized as being not so talented, so maybe a little bit less confident in them. But when it comes to the Cincinnati Bengals, they've got some real competition there with the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Baltimore Ravens. They're nipping at their heels. But, excuse me, other than that, there's not really much of a surprise.
You're right. There aren't really very many surprises. I would say there's more seeds of doubt that you could look at heading into the playoffs. You know, Tom Brady, is he going to be able to ride out this somewhat weak receiving core deep into the playoffs? Peyton Manning, there's been questions whether or not he's fully healthy, as John Gruden was analyzing his throwing motions, seeing that he's throwing more sidearm lately as opposed to over the top. So there's wonder maybe that's the reason why the Broncos haven't been so potent offensively lately. And you look at other teams that are in that conference, like the Indianapolis Colts, they haven't been able to close out the big games against the playoff teams. They've lost to New England. They've lost to Denver. They've lost to Pittsburgh. They've lost to all of these competitive teams. So you wonder if once they reach the playoffs, if that trend will continue. I think that there's certainly reasonable doubt for every one of these teams, especially the Bengals, who have, like you said, have the Steelers right on their heels. I think that the Steelers are actually going to be able to pull ahead of them in the coming weeks.
I do as well. I don't think that the Bengals can really hold on to that. With both the Steelers and the Ravens, I don't give them any shot. In fact, I'm predicting that the Steelers are going to take that division.
How about the NFC? We have the Cardinals, Packers, Eagles, and Falcons leading the division. What are your picks for Week 15 games, and what's your reaction over there?
You know, when it comes to Week 15 games that I really thought were important in the AFC, the 2 that really kind of jumped out to me was the Bengals-Browns game, first off. Like we just said, those 2 teams, they're in the contention for spots. The Bengals have 2 teams going at them for the division lead, which would put them in the wild card race, and the Browns themselves are in a wild card race. While the Broncos and the Chargers are also my other big game, with really not the best Broncos team that we're seeing. They certainly aren't as dominant as they were last year, where they beat pretty much everybody with no effort whatsoever. In a game with the Chargers that I think is going to be fairly close. The Chargers usually keep up with Manning and the Broncos.
And it's always very low scoring with the Chargers. I mean, we just saw it against the Patriots, that it was a very low scoring affair between the 2 teams.
It's a little surprising.
Absolutely, yes. I would say that coming up, as far as games to watch for the upcoming year, I think that tonight is the Monday Night Football game between the Packers and the Falcons, which is honestly the last thing the Falcons needed this week. You know, as they're trying to make that push in a weak division, they're trying to steal the division, and they come across Aaron Rodgers at home. It's just such a difficult draw for them at this point in the season. And the other game to watch really would be the Arizona Cardinals against the St. Louis Rams on Thursday Night Football. I think that the Rams, you know, they're hot all of a sudden. They have back-to-back shutouts. And all of a sudden, they're starting to rise from the depths of that division, whereas the Arizona Cardinals are desperately trying to crawl to the finish line with Drew Stanton as their quarterback. I think it's going to be important that they send the message that they can win multiple games with Stanton, and I think that it's going to be important for maybe the Rams to try and steal the division, honestly, or even a wild card spot, because they do have that chance now.
AFC, NFC, only one comes out from each division. Who makes it to the Super Bowl?
Oh, you know, my AFC team was pretty easy for me. I'm going with the New England Patriots. It's a really toss-up between the Denver Broncos and the Patriots for me. I don't think anyone's really going to question that one of those 2 teams is going to end up going to the Super Bowl. But the fact that Manning has pretty bad history against Brady and Belichick is enough for me to give the Pats the win to go to the Super Bowl. I think it's going to happen. It's going to be a tremendous game, possibly better than the Super Bowl, but it will happen.
You know, I have the Broncos coming out of the AFC, and I'll tell you why. Is that Peyton Manning lately, just coming off of his game against Buffalo, Manning was not very good at all. Had no touchdowns, 2 interceptions, less than 200 yards. How often do you see that from Peyton Manning, really? But the Broncos were still able to come away with a win. And I think that that game is really a great point in that the Broncos can win without Peyton Manning. I think that if you eliminate Tom Brady out of New England's faction, you see that New England can't win unless Tom Brady is dominating the game because they have a weak receiving core, and their defense, it's been a little questionable lately. It started off hot, but now all of a sudden it's starting to falter. And by all means, they probably should have lost the game against the San Diego Chargers. The Chargers let them hang in there all game, so they were finally able to steal it in the fourth quarter. So I wonder whether or not their ability to win eliminating the quarterbacks from the equation would mean a lot for the Denver Broncos. I think the Broncos would be able to meet the Green Bay Packers, who I think are the NFC favorites at this point. I think it's pretty safe to say that because the Packers are going to gain home field advantage, and honestly, Rodgers has just been so hot at home. I think you're going to see Rodgers versus Manning in the Super Bowl. I think that's going to be a great matchup.
I think most people can agree that you need a great coach to get you to the Super Bowl. Who wins Coach of the Year?
Well, I actually didn't bring up my NFC team that's going to the Super Bowl, and it's coincidentally the team that I have with the Coach of the Year, Bruce Arians and the Cardinals. I made this prediction on pretty much no statistics whatsoever. Every single year, I make a prediction before the season starts of what team is going to win the Super Bowl. I've been doing it for a couple of years. I picked the Patriots the year they lost in the Super Bowl. Then I picked the 49ers the year they lost in the Super Bowl. And then,
so you've got a great streak of luck going.
Yes, but last year I picked the Seahawks, who finally proved me correct. And this year I said, you know what, there's no one team I definitely think is going to make it and win. But I get the feeling it's going to be some team that we don't expect, someone that we don't think is going to be any good this year. And so far, that's the Arizona Cardinals. It's written all over them.
Absolutely, yes. I think that Bruce Arians has done a great job. I, too, had Bruce Arians as the Coach of the Year, really, for the Arizona Cardinals, especially considering the fact that they've been able to win without Carson Palmer. I think that having Drew Stanton slide in there and still be able to manage an offense, because you do have to change around your system a little bit, having Stanton in there instead of Palmer. I think that the changes that he's made really to their offensive system have proved to be very effective. I think that their defense has been so steady and so stingy all year. I think that it's just been so great that the Cardinals have been able to rise to prominence the way they have. I think they surprised a lot of people this year, and I think that it is largely in part to Bruce Arians.
What about the fact that the Seahawks have been playing so well and the Cardinals have a very tough remaining schedule? I mean, they might not even make it to the playoffs.
That is very true, yes. I do think the Seahawks have been very hot lately. They are on a 3-game win streak. Russell Wilson is finally starting to find his groove. And honestly, they've been riding beast mode Marshawn Lynch, all season long. I think that Lynch has been absolutely fantastic. But I don't think that they're going to be able to surge past the Cardinals. The Cardinals are going to hang on by the skin of their teeth.
I've got them hanging on to that as well. I know Seattle is surging right now. They're certainly got some confidence, some swagger back in them after the stumble they had to begin the season. And history isn't on their side with Super Bowl champions getting back into the playoffs the following year. But I think that they're resurgent enough to get a wild card spot. But because of the resolve we've seen out of the Arizona Cardinals, they're not going to be able to take them out of that division spot. So it's really going to be a good wild card game to watch.
That's it for the NFL this season. When we return, we'll be talking about baseball and college basketball. Welcome back. So the NCAA may have already seen its upset of the season when NJIT defeated Michigan by a score of 72-70. Yes, you heard that right. How did this happen?
Honestly, I think this is just a comedy of errors for Michigan's athletic program at this point, because after their abysmal football season full of controversy and full of lackluster play, I don't think anyone forgets the loss that Michigan football had to Appalachian State not a couple of years ago. Now all of a sudden you throw in this loss to NJIT, which was literally the worst team in college basketball not a couple of years ago when they had lost 51 consecutive games. This is embarrassing for Michigan. I mean, there's nothing else to say about it. It was embarrassing.
There's really not a ton of things to say other than it was an upset, and it's going to be the upset of the year until March Madness. The championship game, which will come down where the Kansas Jayhawks will stun the world and win the championship. It will be the upset of the year because they will defeat the Kentucky Wildcats and finally claim their vengeance after losing to them in the championship 3 years ago.
So now you don't have NJIT in the finals. That's what you're trying to tell me. I think that's bold.
Now to switch over to what's been the talk of the town this week, the Yankees with their newest acquisitions. What do you guys think about that?
I think they're smart, at the very least, because it buys leverage over their other negotiations. They brought in lefty Andrew Miller for leverage over their closer David Robertson to try and bring him in cheaper. You bring in Didi Gregorius to fill in at shortstop to platoon with Brendan Ryan, and having Martin Prado on the roster as well from midseason gets leverage over Chase Headley at third base. So I think they're smart acquisitions. I don't think they bring them a title. I mean, it's not like last year where they were spending like crazy to bring in Beltran and Ellsbury and all of those free agents, but I do think they're savvy moves at the very least.
I do think that there's smart moves. I don't know if it's totally about leverage. I think that they honestly believe that these were the moves they needed to make. I think it was Cashman's plan all along to bring in Andrew Miller, and he certainly got a good deal, only getting him for $9 million a year. I know reportedly he had an extra $4 million a year coming from Houston, but he turned that down to join the Yankees. And in addition to that, the Gregorius trade, originally I was very upset with that because statistically he's not hitting well, but when I looked up an advanced metric about how hard a player hits a ball and the batting average that a player has when they hit the ball hard, Gregorius was far below league average. And if he even gets to league average, he's going to hit 260 instead of 220. And suddenly, the Yankees look like they made some pretty good moves for pretty much not much commitment.
You know what's a point that I want to make just briefly is that Andrew Miller gets 4 years, $9 million per year. That is a contract that only the Yankees can throw at their setup man. Because that's what he's going to be. I have no doubt that they're going to bring in David Robertson again.
Really?
So to throw in their setup man for 4 years, $9 million, that's laughable. That's just the Yankees mocking the system. That's unfair.
And we'll close our show, as always, with Speak Up. Casey?
The New York Mets are about as haunted as an MLB franchise can be. But I'm not talking about a Curse of the Bambino or Curse of the Billy Goat type scenario. The Mets are haunted by real live ghosts, and their names are Fred and Jeff Wilpon. For nearly 30 years now, fate has been nothing short of unkind to the Mets. And now, after 5 straight seasons of laughable mediocrity, the Mets are on the verge of regaining some momentum. But that won't stop the Wilpons from inevitably getting in the way of progress. For all their talk of how the team's finances have not been compromised because of the Bernie Madoff scandal, the payroll has been cut to the bone, and the result has been nothing short of minor league caliber players fulfilling major roles. Now as the winter meetings begin, the Mets face glaring needs at shortstop, in the bullpen, and at bench outfielder. But don't hold your breath for the Mets to spring for Alexei Ramirez. Don't expect them to chase after David Robertson, who would be a major step up from patchwork projects like Kyle Farnsworth or Jose Valverde. Don't even wait for them to get a legitimate lefty specialist like Craig Breslow. The Mets are pretenders. The Wilpons want fans to believe that they have a plan in place. They don't. On opening day, either Ruben Tejada or Wilmer Flores will still be at short. The bullpen will still have no names like Buddy Carlisle or Dana Eveland. And Michael Kadire, who turns 36 next year, will not be the difference maker to propel the Mets into contention. Brace yourself, Mets fans. Harvey or no Harvey, you're in for more of the same old sad story next year. You could be good, if only your owners cared enough to fix the problem.
The MLB offseason is well underway as the winter meetings have begun in San Diego, and there's a lot of news buzzing already. Over the past week, numerous teams have made big moves. The Yankees signing Andrew Miller to a 4-year, $36 million contract and trading for young shortstop Didi Gregorius. The Toronto Blue Jays traded for third baseman Josh Donaldson, while the Seattle Mariners agreed to a 4-year, $57 million contract. The Atlanta Braves signed Nick Markakis to a 4-year deal after trading away Jason Hayward in exchange for Shelby Miller. And the Oakland Athletics have traded first baseman Brandon Moss to the Cleveland Indians. In addition to these moves, there are many more stories buzzing around the baseball world. The bidding for John Lester seems to be at a near conclusion, as his deal could be announced any minute now. While most likely will be followed by James Shields and Francisco Liriano, signing with the teams that lost out on Lester. Trade rumors are swirling around left-hander Cole Hamels, who has several suitors including Chicago Cubs and Boston Red Sox, the possibility of the Atlanta Braves trading away young star outfielder Justin Upton, and the eventual Oakland Athletics trade of star pitcher Jeff Samardzija, and the fate of star right-hander Max Scherzer, who surprisingly has had absolutely no word on any type of deal or the team that he could be playing for next season. Among those stories, there are many others floating around the baseball world, and it will certainly be an entertaining, must-follow offseason as usual.
New York Knicks president Phil Jackson met with the media earlier today regarding the team's poor performance this season. The Knicks are 4-18, only 1 game ahead of the 76ers in the Atlantic Division, prompting Jackson to express his acute displeasure. Jackson notably said, quote, "There's some resistance to discipline, order, and culture change," end quote, and, quote, "We have a loser's mentality," end quote. He's particularly concerned for how long this losing streak may affect free agents' view of the team, understandably so considering the current state of the Knicks roster. The defensive end is unquestionably subpar, and the triangle offense is, to put it kindly, a work in progress. The Knicks hardly get any fast break points, and they're the worst team in the NBA at defensive rebounding. 7 of their past 8 losses have been by 7 points or less, and in their past 5 losses, the Knicks have been within 1 score of the opposition with less than 5 minutes to play. It's a tough situation in which Carmelo Anthony has never found himself. While Coach Derek Fisher recognizes that the team has a long way to go, Anthony is maintaining a positive attitude. The Knicks seem destined for the draft lottery, which may be a good thing as the franchise is clearly in need of a full rebuild. There you have it with our final episode of the This Week in Sports series for the semester. Tune in this spring for all new episodes. I'm Olivia Jakewith, he's Casey Bryant, and that's Dustin Cooley. We're off.